Yeah, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about chapter 10 uh, of, of developmental psychology. Excuse me. We're really starting to leave adolescence behind. The main question in chapter 10 is what is it that makes us an adult? This is the transition, the role transition, the age transition between adolescence and young adulthood. Is it really different? I'm not sure you can always tell just physically looking at a person whether they're an adolescent or a young adult. You're sitting here, you may be in many areas of your life still considering yourself adolescents. You may be sitting here and saying, well, I'm really an adult. So the question is, what is it that makes you an adult? Is it age? Is it just life decisions? What is it? And so we're looking, I'll mention a couple I think, what are important as far as our American society, what makes us adults. Um, this is a period we'll call emerging adulthood, the late adolescence to early adulthood. This is almost a different age, a different stage of development, because the point is it's emerging. Adulthood is emerging. We would not we would expect the person to be an adult, to be able to make adult decisions, to be able to deal with things on an adult level. So, like, if you were to commit a crime, you would be tried as an adult because of your age. But it's emerging, so there are areas that we wouldn't be able to say, well, I just expect that person to always be able to do all of that on his or her own. So there's a transition here, but there's a transition of roles here, what other people expect you, how other people define you. Not that that's necessarily who you are, but how other people define you. There's also an idea called the rites of passage. What is it that causes you to be able to say I am an adult, and what is it that would allow another person to say, well, he or she did this, so that makes them an adult. And you go through history and we see that a lot of cultures have a rite of passage. It's marked usually marked, but when the onset of puberty, right after that, there's this rite of passage. But in our society, probably a rite of passage would be to go to college. Um, you're in college, so that's why I say you can apply this emerging adulthood to you, because even though you might have a family you have to support, no one would really expect you to be able to say, okay, I can go and do this, because you have this anchor, you have this connection with the local community college. But I mean, y'all are doing this online, so there's less of that connection. But it's still a rite of passage. You're still not quite appreciated as being fully moving into your careers and stuff. We'll also bring into this discussion a psychological view. If you remember, I talked about identity being the central psychosocial crisis of adolescence. Well, young adulthood has this central crisis called intimacy. Um, what is intimacy? Well, intimacy is dependent upon identity. People who don't know who they are not people who are able to plug in relationship with other people. Intimacy is is really essentially your ability to know yourself and trust yourself enough so that you can kind of set yourself aside, or allow yourself to be vulnerable in the presence of another person. This is usually found for our horizontal relationships, which are generally romantic at this point. But you could also be intimate with your own children, I suppose. I mean, you would have to at some point be intimate, like, say you need to be able to do this, but your child needs you to do that, something else. So you have to put yourself aside. Are people ready for that? Well, some people are not, and this is where intimacy comes. The opposite of intimacy is isolation, and what happens is a lot of people are not able to, are not ready to put themselves aside for another person, to trust themselves to another person, and to allow themselves to become vulnerable. Consequently, what happens is they go through life isolated. They're alone. And maybe they're not alone physically, but they're alone inside psychologically because they don't have people to trust. They don't know who they are, you know. Okay. We're also going to see in the context of emerging adulthood becoming financially independent. And I think if I were to say, I've asked a lot of people, what is it that makes you an adult? This is usually the answer I get is, I pay my own bills. I pay my own bills. So that right there allows you to say, I feel like an adult because I'm responsible. If I don't go to work, I am going to go hungry or become homeless or something like that. Um, and so this is really most people I've talked to, that's their answer is when they feel like they're financially independent. Consequently, you could be in your 40s, um, and you're still living at home because you don't feel like you're financially independent. And these are people in this situation who feel psychologically as if they're still adolescents or they're still at least in emerging adulthood, but they don't feel like adults because they don't feel like they can take care of themselves. When I say that, I think of all the couple of people I've read about in the news recently, um, like the guy who owes his girlfriend child support, and so anyway, it's beside the point. Anyway, so what else can we say about emerging adulthood? Again, I said I'm not sure you can always really tell the difference between adolescence and young adults as far as physically. Young adult is probably the time of our lives that we're healthiest or strongest. You don't see a lot of young adults really just dropping dead over diseases, or if you do, then there is a problem. It's an epidemic or something. uh, Physically we're strong, we're fast, mentally we're probably very smart. um, we haven't, and young adult we have probably haven't reached the point at which we're going to start to forget things. That should just generally happen. So I'm not just talking about people with Alzheimer's. I mean older people just generally forget things. Or also it's the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence. When we talk about fluid intelligence, this is the time, the peak of our lives is young adulthood. With fluid intelligence, that's your ability to think quickly, to solve problems quickly, which is good because that's usually the time that we have more problems to solve. Um, Before midlife and later on when life kind of tends to slow down. Crystallized intelligence builds the rest of our lives, though, so that older people are probably the highest in crystallized intelligence. That's what do you know? And that just makes sense that with crystallized intelligence, that's going to continue to build because you're continuing to experience things, to meet people, to learn new words for things, and stuff like that. Neuroscience shows us that cognitively we're healthiest at this point. We have, in young adulthood, we've reached the peak of cognitive function. Your brain is, in at least at some point during early adulthood or emerging adulthood, it's going to hit that 100% mark. This is the point we've been looking forward to in adolescence, the time that we'll fully be able to function and make decisions and stuff like that. We'll also, let's talk about how we use our minds. We'll also be able to use our minds the best or the most efficiently in order to solve problems. we'll be able to go beyond formal operational reasoning where we're looking at abstract concepts, but we'll be able to go to what we call post-formal, where it's not just rational, but we'll also be able to integrate into that the affective, the emotional, and intuitive thinking in order to make a good decision. Yeah, for example, I mean, people who have children understand this because I have to experience this. You can't do the same with each child. Your children require sort of a different approach. They can all do the same behavior, but you can't punish them the same. I remember a friend who had three sons. He had three sons. One of them, he could just raise his voice, and the kid would snap to and just, get right back on track. The second son required, he was very, I don't know, he liked to talk or he liked to listen. And so everything was like, you see why this is wrong and how this affects or whatever. The third son, you certainly wouldn't want to yell at him. He wouldn't respond to a lot of of intellectual whatever, but he was so sensitive that maybe even just a look would be enough, but you couldn't really look too sharp with him because he would just break. And so what this means is that we have different ways of solving a problem, and this is what adults learn, is how to use their minds, their emotions in order to solve problems and to deal with stuff. One last point, and then I'll let you go. One last point is, how do we see ourselves in young adulthood? And this is probably a time where we really are going to integrate that identity we've already established with real life, which means a lot of scenarios and life stories and possible selves and all of this. One point, though, I think that I really want you to understand from this chapter, and this what we call personal control beliefs. To what degree do you believe that what happens in your life is contingent upon your choices and your decisions? People who are healthiest are people who believe very strongly in the control beliefs. I didn't get that because I see what I should have done differently. I messed that up because I'm taking responsibility for that. I'm sorry that I did that, but I can do better and I will do better. Also, though there is a healthy acceptance that there is a certain part of our lives that are beyond our control. You know, you can take care of yourself. You can, not drink and drive or whatever, but there's always that one other person who doesn't, and then that person can have an effect on us. Um, anyway, a lot of good things to think about. I'm looking forward to hearing from you in our discussions, and I hope you're having a great week. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again for Chapter 11.